You may be seated. Good morning, everyone. In Hebrew, we would say Boker Tov. And if this were the synagogue on the Sabbath, I would say Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It's a day for worship, for peace. It's a day for family and community. And it's a day for God. And so I take the liberty to say Shabbat Shalom. Let me begin by expressing my gratitude to you, to the members of this parish, to your wonderful leadership, and especially to my dear friend, Father Andrew Sherman, for inviting me to speak this morning and to be honored by this wonderful congregation. After 42 years in the active pulpit rabbinate, 31 years of them in Boca Raton at B'nai Torah congregation. At the end of my active pulpit career, I received a number of beautiful awards and honors, and each one of them had very special meaning to me. They were an affirmation of hard work and a purpose-driven life. Members of the clergy and those who watch the work of clergy, men and women, understand that our work is always so very public. And in that we receive our share of compliments and praise. But we also receive our share of complaints. And so one is not always sure how one's work is received. And so receiving an honor such as this is truly appreciated. Interfaith work has always been so important to me. This one has and will always have a special place in my heart and on my mind. I have always, from my youngest years, been involved in activities and with groups that crossed boundaries. And so being cited for interfaith work is important. And receiving this recognition from St. Gregory's Episcopal Church has special resonance. And some of it's really personal, so let me explain. I will tell you that it's not the first time that an Episcopal church has honored a Steinhardt. Here's a story that I carry. I grew up in a factory town in a working-class family. My father, Manny, was an electrician, a very hard worker. He taught me the value of hard work. He lived with a great sense of respect for others. He didn't wear Judaism as a badge of honor on his sleeve, but rather he was always humble about his place in the world in all different ways and manifestations. He was a veteran of the United States Navy during World War II, and he had many experiences during those years where he was the only Jew, or the only Jew that many people had ever met. But he made a decision that he would always be proud of who he was and where he came from. He taught me to take pride in that. He was orphaned very young, raised by older sisters and a brother, aunts and uncles. And he had an uncle who was an electrical contractor who sent him to trade school. My father became an electrician. And most of his years he worked as a journeyman electrician, but towards the end of his career he became a foreman and directed a few very large projects in Bridgeport and in the area. But there was one project that stood out in his mind and for our family, and he spoke about it almost till the day he died. It was the most important project he ever directed. He was given the challenge to design the lighting and the renovation of a Gothic revival large Episcopal church, which was built in 1873. The church was on the National Registry. The church also was at a major intersection in downtown Bridgeport, about a mile from the beach. Topographically, Bridgeport ascends from Long Island Sound in its south up to the north end And on a clear day, one can see Long Island Sound and the steeple of this beautiful cathedral, at least during the day. Over time, a great number of the church's supporters moved away, and it began to fall into disrepair. The demographics had changed, but yet this cathedral retained an element of its glory. It was the oldest church in Bridgeport, and a new church leadership decided to do a renovation. My father executed the lighting project inside and outside the church. Almost an entire year, my father went to church every day. He would come home reporting on the people that he met, the progress of the project, and he spoke a lot about the young pastor. They became friends. And when the project was finished, and we would drive at night and look down Park Avenue and see the illuminated steeple, my father would say with great pride, my father was one person who would call me not David, but Dave. He said, "Dave, look at my church." Well, there was a dedication ceremony for the new church, and I went with my mother and my father. And amongst the people who were honored that evening was my father. My dad and the priest got to know each other quite well. They learned from each other, and they had great respect for each other. The light made a difference. And this is what I recall. I recall the grandeur of that sanctuary, the beauty of the pipe organ and its choir, its music, and how the tradition combined with a very contemporary message. I've told Father Andrew that if I were a Christian, I would definitely be an Episcopalian. In so many ways, I felt it had so much in common with my own denomination in terms of a reverence for tradition, protection of the glory of worship, and also understanding that outside of the sanctuary, we were also responsible for a larger community, caring and giving. And I have to say, and maybe this is presumptuous, but I think Andrew would be a conservative Jew. There are two other reasons that I rejoice in this honor. My mother, the maternal side of my family, were refugees from Nazi Germany. They left Germany in 1937 in the nick of time to save their lives, but not soon enough to save the older generation, all of whom died in Auschwitz. In spite of their experiences, my grandmother and my mother were always open to others. They were respectful of all people, and they taught me that. In my mother's case, she was involved in a larger community. So many refugees and children of survivors live with a tremendous sense of pain and resentment, understandably caused by trauma and loss. They made a decision to remain proud Jews, not to separate themselves from the community, and as I said, remaining respectful of all individuals and people. They understood that everyone is created in the image of God. And they also understood that every person has free will, the freedom to choose how they will be in this world and how they will treat others. My grandmother used to receive monthly letters from a neighbor of hers, a Christian woman from Karlsruhe, Germany. And when I was old enough to see the mail on her kitchen counter, I would ask her about that letter. And my grandmother would say it was from a dear friend of hers, who she loved and loved her. And I would say, "Nana, how can you remain friends with her?" And my grandmother would say, "She was a very good person." And then repeat, "Everyone has the potential for good and evil." She was no theologian, but she was a sensitive and a very wise woman. The very first time I spoke in a church was Thanksgiving 1982, my first year as a rabbi, and it was a Byzantine Orthodox church. It was not lit as well as this place. I was the first rabbi ever to speak there, and I was a bit overwhelmed. I was quite young, and it was an awesome place. And I'll tell you that now I stand here feeling at ease. I feel so welcomed by this church. I feel comfortable here. because of all of you and the relationships that we have developed. This is an affirmation not just of the work of a rabbi and a priest, but rather an affirmation that we are friends and we are neighbors and we are responsible for one another. And finally, this is lived out in the lives of your wonderful pastor, Father Andrew and Anita. And Anita, I hope that you're able to watch. Anita has a really bad cold. We realized a long time ago that interfaith dialogue was dependent on every clergy person who engaged in it, every person who engaged in it with open hearts. And Andrew and I committed ourselves to meet together, to speak together, to share ideas and ideals, to talk about our families and our past, the influences that shaped us, our nation and our concerns. But it wasn't out of a theology, but rather it was out of relationship, a relationship of respect that grew into a relationship of love. And we grew this thing together with other clergy, men and women, over 2 decades ago. You have been so very fortunate to have Father Andrew and Anita in the life of this church. And Toby and I have been very fortunate to have them as friends. So let me talk a little bit about the interfaith conversation. And I think its integrity depends on 2 things which are different. They're different poles. They come from life's experiences, and they come from our texts and our faith, from where our values have grown. I'll begin with essential early texts that have directed me. Our rabbis asked a few questions about the creation of the first man, Adam, and the first woman, Eve. They wanted to know why the narrative began with just one man and one woman. And their answer is so very beautiful. They say it's so no one can say that my ancestors are greater than your ancestors. We all come from the same place, a common source. There is a midrash, which is part of the Talmud. The Talmud, a lengthy literary work that records the conversations of ancient rabbis. They ask about the creation, and referring to the 2nd chapter of Genesis, which repeats the creation of Adam, it says that Adam was created out of the dust of the earth. And so they say a very few interesting things. They say, where does the dust come from? And they indicated that the dust came from every corner of the earth. There was red earth and brown earth and black earth and white sand, and it all came together to make a human being. We are part of each other. You know that the first children who were born were Cain and Abel. And you also know it didn't work out too well. For they're asked to bring offerings to God, and the offering that Abel brought was accepted and enjoyed by the Holy One, but not Cain's offering. And we know little else except the way this story ends. Cain murders Abel. It's a story that the Bible wants us to know. And though there are important interpretations, there are many more questions than answers. One of the questions comes from the text itself. Let us say that the murder takes place because each of the brothers wanted to be favored by their father, their God. And when Cain realizes that Abel's gift was accepted, he responds with rage. And the Bible then presents a question. God asks Cain, where is your brother Abel? And Cain responds with a question that's not answered in the text. But it's a question that we all must always ask ourselves. And the question is, am I my brother's keeper? And it's not answered because it's up to each one of us to answer. We are the keepers of our brothers and our sisters. And God loves all of us. And we have to choose to accept that love and to bring that love into our lives. And we understand that we gain knowledge of God, we experience God through the love of others. Interfaith work begins with the capacity to understand that which we hold in common, what it means to be a human being, and what are our responsibilities to make the world better. And for each of us, it may begin in our own parish or congregation. It continues in our community and grows outward. Over the years, BRICA, the Boca Raton Interfaith Group, engaged in that way through a number of different projects in a number of different ways. Muslims, Christians, Jews, we come together in support of each other during difficult times of great tragedy that has occurred to our people or our country. We've come together to celebrate our commonality as Americans, and we come together to give thanks. And we've come together in an expression that we care about all of our brothers and sisters, be it housing in this community, feeding the poor, where we have such a special relationship, sheltering the homeless, giving safe space and expression, a voice to immigrants. It's a very beautiful part of interfaith work. And by the way, I believe the most significant work of all is being done by BRIA, the Organization of Interfaith Understanding and Work for our Youth. And it's led by Georgina and our Kathy. But the second dimension of it perhaps can be found a little bit later in Genesis. And it's emphasized in all of our traditions. And that is when Abraham is called to leave his homeland, to leave his parents' house, and to begin a new people that would be based on justice and righteousness. Because of reasons of history and culture and ethnicity, because of the parents we come from and what is our own lot in life, there are differences between us. Interfaith work doesn't wipe out our differences, the things we believe in and where we come from and the texts we hold dear. As individuals, and in particular our faith traditions, we have a unique and different identity. No two people are the same. No two people sitting here are the same. There are differences in the way we approach God, and the way we worship, and the way we see ourselves, and the way we see others. And so this interfaith dialogue has also been about respecting difference and understanding boundaries. That's the only way each of us can have a unique identity and preserve it. It's true for every one of us. And it's true with people and groups of people. I sense from history when there's an expectation that we all be the same, believe the same, think the same, or dress the same. When we lose respect for difference and no longer understand the need for boundaries, we give rise to autocracy. We can fall into totalitarianism, and we open the doors for fascism. We have the right to be different. We all have the obligation to respect difference. Pluralism with the understanding that we're all different and the call to respect difference is a key part of our dialogue. And for that matter, it's essential for democracy and freedom and peace. And so we recognize that we're all in this together, while at the same time we hold on to the understanding that there's difference. And sometimes it's a difficult balance. We have to overcome the suspicion that comes when we don't know the other. And we do that by getting to know the other and seeing each other. In the Jewish mystical tradition, the teachers taught that God's light is too vast for any single vessel to contain it. So the divine light is refracted through many different traditions and many practices, containing many stories, and every one is a prism to God's truth. Our job then is not to compete for who holds all the light, but rather to rejoice that the light shines on everyone. And we add our reflection to it in interfaith dialogue. And I believe it's needed more than ever. Being able to see the other is so critical to understanding, and when you understand the other, you no longer fear them. And when you no longer fear, you no longer hate. I often wish that the highest levels of diplomacy would include religious leaders who are committed not only to their own truths, but to the truth that everyone brings to the table. And I've come to realize that so much of the conflict and war that we have seen in the recent past comes not from decent people on each side, but rather from extremists, and often religious extremists, who think, like Cain, that God has to love me better. And so they perpetuate conflict. Perhaps they think that the conflict will lead them to God's acceptance, and it doesn't work. We're all called to be forces for good and understanding and dialogue. Often it's hard, but we are committed to it. Father Andrew sent me a text from today's lectionary, and I found so much in the words that spoke to me, and so much which created questions for me. But in the lectionary, and we heard it read in Isaiah chapter 65, there's a vision of the future where the wolf and the lamb feed together and the lion eats straw like the ox, and they won't hurt or destroy. And it's a metaphor for the vision of God's holy mountain. I don't know if you know this, but there are different versions in the Bible of what will happen when the Messiah comes, or when the second coming of the Messiah will be. We'll talk about that another time. It serves as a great metaphor for a future of peace. For one vision sees a great war that consumes the world with fire, and the other vision sees the wolf and lamb feeding together without hurt, without destruction. Not a vision of violence, but a vision of peace. And that's the vision we can choose. We learn more as we get older, and I believe that we must place the values we all know, which are good for humanity, in the front of our decisions. Fairness, justice, integrity, honesty, kindness, respect, dignity, forgiveness, service, love, and hope. I love the words which define this church right now. And I don't know how many of the guests saw it, but the words are, "Hope dwells here at St. Gregory's." And when I read the words, I thought about the anthem of our people, the Jewish people, through Hatikva, the hope. And I think about the despair that so many feel in the world. And if we give in to that despair and lose hope, we will not improve the world. The psalmist said, Kaveh el Adonai libecha chazak v'ametz kaveh el Adonai. Hope in the Lord, be strong. My friends, there is reason to hope. We have the capacity to act with understanding. We have the ability to see the other and see the image of God. It needs to be treated with respect and reverence. Hope dwells here. Hope dwells in our hearts and our souls. When we see that which makes us similar, and when we respect that which makes us different. Thanks so much for this opportunity. Thank you, and thank you, Father Andrew.